Now we're going to look at Chapter 4, Section 4.3, Using Studies Wisely. So we talked about how we randomly select our individuals for our sample, and then we randomly assign them to treatments. There's a reason that we do this randomization twice. And this table kind of helps. I printed it out on your notes so you don't have to copy it down, but you need to kind of understand how to read it. So on the left-hand side, it asks, were the individuals randomly selected? This is when you are picking them as a part of your sample. So when we went out to our population, did we randomly pick the people that we were going to use in our sample, yes or no? And then at the top, it asks, were the individuals then randomly assigned to groups? So did we take the sample that we got and then randomly assign them to the different treatment groups? So it's two separate things. You'll notice on the last section that we did on 4.2, we talked about some experiments that had volunteers. So in that case, the randomly selected would be no. They were not randomly selected. They were volunteers. But then we took them and we separated them into two groups randomly. So that means that they were randomly assigned. So you're basically just answering yes or no. So we randomly select individuals, the yes or no along the left-hand side, because that can help us give inference about our population. So if we randomly select the individuals, then that means we can take the data that we get from our experiment and use it to make an estimate about our population. If the answer is yes, that we randomly selected them, then can we make an inference about the population? Yes, we can. If the answer is no, we did not randomly select them, they were volunteers or they were a convenient sample, then no, we cannot use that data to say that it applies to everyone in the population. Okay? On the top, where they randomly assigned to groups, that helps us determine if we can tell cause and effect. So if they were randomly assigned to groups, then yes, we can make an inference or an estimate about cause and effect. So we can then say that yes, whatever I'm treating them with does cause something to happen to them. If I did not randomly assign them to the groups, then my answer would be no. I cannot say that it actually does a cause and effect relationship with whatever treatment I'm giving them. Okay, so one of them lets us infer about the population, and the other one lets us infer about cause and effect. So they are important. That's why we talk about both of them. Well-designed experiments randomly assign individuals to treatment groups. However, most experiments don't select them at random. So we talked about how great it is to select your sample from random, and that's wonderful. But when you're doing things like drug trials, anything where there could be side effects, you really can't randomly select, because randomly selecting means that you go to them and you tell them you have to participate in my survey or my study. We can't do that. So when we're testing a new cancer drug, we're not just going to randomly select cancer patients, we're going to ask them to volunteer. So in most experiments, especially the ones that deal with drugs and things like that, the people are not randomly selected from the population, but we can take the sample of people who volunteer and randomly assign them to treatment groups. So it limits those experiments to only inferences about cause and effect, not necessarily about whether or not they can be applied to every single person in the population. Observational studies don't randomly assign individuals to groups, and they don't use random sampling, which is why we don't really want to use them all that often. So we don't have a random sample of people, we don't have a random assignment, so they basically answer no and no to both. They would fall in our table to the bottom right-hand corner, where we cannot make inferences about the population, and we cannot make inferences about cause and effect. So the challenges of establishing causation. A well-designed experiment tells us that changes in explanatory variable cause changes in the response variable. So if we change what we're doing to them, it should change how they react to it, basically. But in some cases, it's not practical or ethical to do an experiment. So we're going to consider these, and this is your first example. So consider these and state whether they would be ethical and practical to perform. So the first one is, does texting while driving increase the risk of having an accident? Is it ethical to perform an experiment on this? In other words, is it ethical to take people and tell them, you are going to drive a vehicle while texting, and you are not. You're going to drive while not texting. That would be that it's not ethical. Because texting while driving can cause an accident and could get someone hurt, that would not be considered an ethical experiment to do. However, we could make it ethical by doing a simulator. So you could have them driving in a simulator where they're not actually on the road in a vehicle. Okay, the second one, does going to church regularly help people live longer? Is it ethical or practical? So I would say for that one that there isn't an ethics issue with it by asking people to go to church regularly, and not really ethic problems with it. You're not going to hurt anyone by doing that. However, it's not really practical, because going to church regularly means they have to do it for an extended period of time, all the time, on a consistent basis. So it's something that's going to take a really long time to perform. So it's not very practical. And then the last one, does smoking cause lung cancer? Well, this is definitely not ethical. We would never tell people that they have to smoke as a part of an experiment, because we know that smoking, because we know that it could cause problems, lung cancer. We've never forced someone to do that. So it is not ethical to do this one. But we talked about how observational studies don't do causation. There are very rare instances where it is possible to build a strong case for causation. It doesn't mean that it 100% proves it, but it can be strong enough that we can use an observational study to say if something causes something else to happen. So when we can't do an experiment, like with the smoking causing lung cancer, we can use the following criteria to establish causation through observational studies. So first of all, is the association very strong? So when they looked at all the previous studies of lung cancer versus smoking, they found that yes, the association was strong. That if you smoked a lot, you were more likely to get cancer than if you smoked a little. So it was a strong association. So as one of them went up, the other one went up. Is the association consistent? That's the next one. So it needs to be strong and it needs to be consistent. So you can't just have, well, half of the people got it and the other half didn't, and it's not very consistent. Only some people get it and some people don't. It needs to be a pretty consistent amount. You can have some that don't, who are, exceptions, but for the most part, it needs to be a consistent relationship between the two variables. The third one is, larger values of the explanatory are associated with stronger responses. So if they smoke more, they are more likely to get lung cancer. If they smoke less, they are less likely to get lung cancer. So it has to be that as your explanatory variable, so the amount you smoke, goes up, then the amount of the response has to go up. The alleged cause precedes the effect in time. So this kind of just makes common sense. If a person gets cancer before they start smoking, then you can't say that smoking is the reason they have cancer. So the cause has to precede the effect. So the smoking has to come first and then the cancer. And then the alleged cause is plausible. So they did find that because of the chemicals in cigarettes, that it was very plausible that those chemicals could cause lung cancer. It has to be something that makes sense. It can't be something that doesn't make sense. Okay, it needs to be something that's plausible, that in the scientific world we could look at and say, okay, yeah, it makes sense that those two things could be connected to each other. Okay, now we're going to talk about data ethics. So data ethics is exactly what it sounds like. It's the ethical rules that you have to follow whenever you're doing any type of experiment on human subjects or animals or anything like that. So the first one is that all planned studies must be reviewed in advance by an institutional review board charged with protecting the safety and well-being of the subjects. You're going to be doing an experimental project when I come back from maternity leave. So we're going to be doing one of those as you're going to work on them in a pair. And a part of that is you're going to have to come to an institutional review board. I'm going to be the institutional review board that's going to look at your experiment and decide if it is ethical or not. In the real world, they have to do that now. This was not always in place. Years ago, it was not required. So they did some pretty unethical experiments in like the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s before they instituted this. Now you have to go to an institutional review board, and they have to look and see, is it ethical what you're doing? All individuals who are subjects must be given informed consent. So what this means is they don't have to know, like for example, when we talked about in the previous section about the migraine, where we had one group of people get migraine medication and the other group get a sugar pill. They don't have to know which one they're getting. They just need to know the possibilities that they could be receiving and the side effects. So they need to be informed that you could get this drug that causes these side effects, or you could get this placebo that causes these side effects. They just need to be informed, and they have to, most of the time, they have to sign stating that they have some sort of contract, that they have been informed of the risks and the side effects and the benefits and all that stuff. They understand that they could be put into any group. So they don't know which group they're into, but they have to understand what the experiment is about. And all individual data must be kept confidential. Only statistical summaries for groups of subjects may be made public. So in other words, you cannot post statistical information about an individual person. So you can't say Sally said that her migraines got better when she was on a placebo. You can't say that. All you can do is take the whole group as a whole and say this percentage of people in the placebo group saw an improvement. This percentage of people in the treatment group saw an improvement. It has to be a group statistic, not an individual statistic. In order for it to be ethical, you have to keep everyone's information confidential.